Good afternoon. My name is Christopher Fandrey. This is my assignment for the University of San Diego, LEPS 510, Communication for Law Enforcement Leaders. The title is The Problems Caused by Not Communicating in Law Enforcement Agencies. Brief overview of the assignment is communication and why it is important. Law enforcement communication, working with outside agencies, communicating within, the dangers of not communicating. We'll talk about some of the failures of the lack of communication and then a brief review. So, what is communication? Well, the Merriam-Webster definition is a process by which information is exchanged between individuals through a common system of symbols, signs, or behavior. It's also a exchange of information. Why is communication important? Well, Fitz's text explains to us in chapter 1 of Law Enforcement, Interpersonal Communication, and Conflict Management, the impact model. It explains that improves officer safety, heightened investigative effectiveness, fewer complaints and lawsuits, career recognition and advancement, better relationships, and a decreased stress and anxiety of law enforcement members. Communication in law enforcement can be face-to-face, it could be informal or it could be formal. It could be emails or memos that can be sent from, anybody that wants to communicate with anybody in other parts of the agency. Communication is also done through training over the radio. And communication can also be verbal or nonverbal. Some of the forms that is used to communicate with outside agencies include things like the memos and emails. There's meetings between department heads or unit supervisors that get together with other agencies and their members and their supervisors. Communicating by phone. People can call each other, they can pick up the phone and they can, ask some questions, they can get with somebody, pretty much do anything over the phone that you need to. Can communicate through dispatch and teletype. When an agency requests another agency to do something, you send out a request, basically. And it's done through teletype. And once that department receives the official documented request of what the other agency is asking them to do, they can look at that teletype, make sure that it, kind of follows through with their policies and procedures, and then they can disseminate that information through their own agency and through their own dispatch to get an officer to go out and go do whatever it is that the other agency needed. There's also bolos that are sent out or just officer safety information that dispatch sends to other agencies. It could be regionally, it could be locally, it could be statewide, it could be nationwide. And then there's also briefing prior to joint operations, especially when you have a outside agency coming in. You want to do a briefing. You want to brief an agency about your policies and procedures, what you're looking for out of the op, what you're trying to do, what you're not trying to do, and things like that. Communication inside the agency is very similar to the communication that's outside of the agencies. You utilize some of the same tools like, your memos, your emails, your briefings, trainings. And all of these can be formal or informal levels of communication. Trainings are always a good one. They can update people about, new laws or new decisions made by the court. And that's the best way to learn is to train. Another way of communicating is through the use of general orders or policies and procedures of the agency. For instance, if something happens or an agency gets like a legal update or they see another agency and something happens and they want to cover themselves and cover their officers, they might update their policies and procedures and then they'll disseminate that out to their agency however they do it. Whether it's electronically or whether the officer has to come in and sign the new policy on a piece of paper, which will be filed away and documented. But that's another form of communication, and it's a good form of communication. What happens when we do not communicate? Well, overall, if you don't communicate, you're definitely not doing your job. All right, many times officers will get hurt just because of the lack of communication. And sometimes people die. That is a huge thing about this career field, is that in law enforcement, when people aren't communicating, not only do people get hurt, but people die. And it's very serious, which is a very serious reason on why you need to communicate. Um, and then, just the lack of communicating can cause a criminal to get away. The bad guy might live to, fight another day and be out on the run another day. Whereas, had there been better communication, that individual may have been caught for their crimes and be able to be put into the judicial system and, ultimately have to face um, a judge and a jury of their peers for the crimes that they may or may not have committed. Also, we might not solve crimes or close cases because of the lack of communication. If agencies aren't communicating with each other, or even just officers aren't communicating with each other, they could tip somebody off, or they could just have a lapse in communication. Um, could be that little small piece that somebody needed to break a case wide open and solve it. Um, and that leads us into the next point. And failure to communicate means the lack of information flowing. When information isn't flowing, you have a problem. Not communicating will place officers of an agency in danger, especially in joint jurisdictional areas. Um, if you're working a crime in an area that has joint jurisdiction, it might just be courtesy to give a heads up that you're going to be in the area or you're doing something. This is whether it's local, regional, county-wide, statewide, even federal-wide law enforcement agencies. You got to communicate with each other to keep everybody safe. Um, and then multiple operations could be going on in the same places. There could be two different law enforcement agencies, or even the same law enforcement agencies, working a case in the same area against the same people, or unfortunately, even against each other. And at the end of the day, all this does is just place the public at risk. It also places officers at risk. But let's talk about some of the pros to communicating. All right. Communicating internally or externally allows for information to flow smoothly. All right. And that's because when you already have that communication process there, then when you update with new information or older information, then you have it. You don't have to do a whole lot more to work through it, and it just makes it a lot easier. Cases become easier to solve with cooperation and more officers being exposed to the facts of the case. When a law enforcement agency is looking for somebody or trying to identify somebody, they can put out a bulletin, send it to as many departments or as few departments as they want to, and just gives more law enforcement officers the ability to see that bulletin and maybe even recognize an individual, or just have some information that might be worthwhile for that primary agency to follow up on. Officer safety drastically improves. Whether it's the Department of Homeland Security or the FBI sending out a bulletin that is talking about a weapon or a new way to conceal a weapon that has been located by, whether it's a federal agency or a local agency, um, disseminating that information makes officers more safe. They might also learn where to better search a vehicle. Um, they might learn just immense amount of information that helps the overall officer be a better officer. It allows us to work together to build a better community and a safer community for everybody. Communication builds lasting relationships that can continue through the introduction of others. So, when you're communicating with somebody at another agency, and you might bring a subordinate or a friend of yours from your agency, and they might bring subordinates or friends or bosses of theirs, and everybody gets together and everybody communicates, and it's a great thing because it builds those relationships that can continue long past um, you and your connection working at your respective agencies. It helps keep that information flowing through agencies, and it allows people to get to know each other, and just allows more people to kind of get along and work together. And it continues that, like I said, that working relationship for years and years to come. Communication ensures everyone's on the same page and helps them know what's going on to avoid dangerous situations. Um, if, for instance, a department is working a robbery that just happened and they have some suspect information, like last known direction of travel or vehicle information, or just the fact that they're armed or they've shot a weapon or something like that, that's important information to know. And that information being disseminated to local agencies allows them to kind of either get out and be a little bit more proactive in their areas, trying to help you out by looking in their own jurisdiction for those bad guys or whatever, or even just to avoid an area so they don't get involved in something that they weren't supposed to be a part of. Like if like the county's coming into a municipality to do a search warrant and they don't communicate with that agency, it could put everybody in a dangerous situation where had a phone call or an email would have been able to give out information to have those officers avoid that area. So unless there's a call for service, so they can keep themselves safe and the officers working on their operation are able to just work on their operation, not have to worry about another agency coming in and possibly messing something up or tipping somebody off and then people get hurt or killed. Another important thing is the failures to talk about. Failures happen all the time in law enforcement, and that's okay. It's okay to fail sometimes. But what is not okay is to continually make the same mistakes that put people in danger, get people killed, or things like that. So, some of the times law enforcement agencies are neglecting to communicate, and bad things have the potential of occurring. There's endless amounts of cases where this has occurred, and we'll talk briefly about a couple of them, including the Detroit Police Department having two precincts that are neighboring to each other, attempting to buy bust each other. One precinct was, the buyers, and they were going to bust the sellers, and the other precinct was the sellers, and they were going to bust the buyers. And then this put, a big, huge thing where blue on blue was occurring. Um, Officers got into a heated argument. Thank God nobody was, seriously injured. A couple people had to go to the hospital, a couple officers. Um, but had the communication been there to begin with, this would have never occurred. Was one precinct right and the other wrong? That's neither here nor there. But it is important to say that, you know, picking up the phone or sending out an email or, reaching out to a contact within another precinct in one agency is big. And that's, a requirement because a lot of the times these precincts are kind of like mini police departments. Although they are the Detroit Police Department, they're the Detroit Police Department in that precinct. And it's not, you know, necessary for them to go into another precinct to enforce the law. They have their own area to work on. It's kind of broken down a little bit more. Um, but again, that lack of communication almost got several officers shot and killed, which was just almost pointless. Another incident was an Albuquerque lieutenant shooting an undercover officer. This Albuquerque lieutenant didn't make briefing. Where do you communicate at? At briefing. So the fact that this lieutenant didn't go to briefing put himself and everybody else a part of this operation at risk. And it caused them to have a situation where this lieutenant saw someone pull a gun, didn't know that it was an undercover officer, and he shoots the undercover officer several times. Had the lieutenant been to briefing, he would have known that that officer was going to be sitting there. He probably would have known that that officer was going to be armed. And he wouldn't have been able to put himself in a situation where he almost killed another police officer, just for the simple lack of communication. Um, and I also think that some of the members of that operation should have been like, "Hey, LT, like you might need to sit this one out because you weren't at briefing." And sometimes we're, worried about hurting people's feelings or hurting people's pride, but at the end of the day, the only thing we do is hurt each other with the lack of communicating. Another incident was where an off-duty NYPD officer shot a transit police officer. who was working an undercover pickpocketing operation. Um, at this time, the New York Police Department had a system in place to avoid situations just like this, and they called it the color of the day. Not a whole lot is really discussed about color of the day, um, and whether or not it's really still utilized. But one thing that is important is that NYPD had a way to put undercover officers in a positive situation where they had a headband or some article of clothing or even an armband that was a certain color, and that would tell other officers that, hey, that's a detective, or that's an undercover officer that's in plain clothes. um, and it just helps out a little bit more because obviously undercover officers couldn't carry their badges, or they're not really doing a whole lot of undercover work if they are searched by bad guys and gangs or whatever operation they're working in. And unfortunately, though, the Transit Police Department at this time was not utilizing color of the day. They knew about it. They knew what the NYPD was doing, but they were not following what the NYPD was doing. And unfortunately, at this time also, the transit police were not a part of NYPD. So it caused a undercover officer to be shot, and it caused a off-duty police officer to get charged with a crime because he shot at a police officer. And there was a huge ordeal about it, and it all started because of the lack of communication. Neither one of those officers identified themselves to the other person. Had the transit officer said, "Hey, I'm police," off-duty NYPD officer would have been like, "Oh man, I'm police too," and that might have, helped avoid that confrontation from occurring. The same thing goes if the off-duty NYPD officer had announced himself as a police officer. Transit police officer probably would have immediately identified himself. But this doesn't just stop, with law enforcement agencies either. Another big thing is not communicating with the fire department. Law enforcement officers and fire departments are not being able to communicate, um, has also led to dangerous situations and possibly even more deaths occurring. Situations like 9/11 and September 11th, 2001. NYPD and FDNY could not communicate with each other, and there was some very serious situations that occurred because of that. People were getting hurt. More people got killed than probably should have happened had these two agencies and departments been able to communicate better. Um, Same thing with the Las Vegas shooting um, from the Mandalay Bay Hotel. The police department and the fire department didn't communicate very well, and the law enforcement agency didn't communicate very well with itself. There was a lot of chaos. Obviously, it's an ongoing situation, um, but communicating could have saved countless lives um, in this situation. The Parkland, Florida shooting at Stoneman Douglas High School. Um, this was another situation where law enforcement was not effectively communicating with the fire department. Fire department didn't effectively communicate with the law enforcement, and law enforcement didn't effectively communicate with law enforcement. There's multiple agencies responding, um, not all utilizing the same radio, not utilizing the same dispatching system, which is fine, but you got to communicate when you go to these big named events like mass shootings and stuff, because at the end of the day, the only thing you're doing is placing everybody in risk if no one's communicating. Another incident that the Broward County Sheriff's Office had was the Fort Lauderdale Airport shooting. Um, Nobody during this situation was communicating well. There were several law enforcement agencies self-dispatching themselves to the call outside of their jurisdiction, when not even being requested to respond. Um, and then there was lack of communication with fire departments and with the EMS personnel. And again, this is something that could have been learned upon and actually helped the Parkland shooting, because the Fort Lauderdale shooting occurred, a couple years prior, but again, sometimes we don't learn from our mistakes in law enforcement, and it gets people hurt and it gets people killed. All right. And in closing, like we have discussed, communication is just the sharing of information. Law enforcement communication is important because sharing information saves lives and it also solves cases. There's many forms of communication, both internally and externally, when it comes to communicating with the agency or other agencies. And at the end, failing to communicate has been known to place the community and officers in risk of bodily harm. And that brings us to the end. Here's the first reference page and then the second reference page. Once again, my name is Christopher Fandrey, and I appreciate you following along here with my Week 7 assignment for LEPS 510, Communication for Law Enforcement Leaders.